afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. With my dear co-chair, His Excellency Pak Suharyanto, I would like to call to order the first midterm review plenary entitled Resourcing Risk-Informed, Regenerative and Sustainable Development. Now, let me take this opportunity to cordially welcome you all to this first plenary dedicated to the midterm review of the implementation of the Sendai Framework. I'm honored to serve as your co-chair, together, as I have mentioned, with His Excellency Pak Suharyanto, head of the National Disaster Management Authority, BNPB, of the Republic of Indonesia. This session is a critical input to the midterm review of the Sendai Framework, along with everything else that comes from this global platform. The member states called for this midterm review to first take stock of progress of implementation of the framework since 2015. Second, examine changes in the context and new emerging issues since that time of adoption and those expected in the period to 2030. And third, examine renovations to risk governance and risk management that can accelerate and amplify actions to achieve the outcome and goal of the Sendai Framework. Now, this midterm review plenary provides both states and non-state stakeholders the golden opportunity to contribute to the co-chair summary as well. And once it will be incorporated into the process of the midterm review, it will feed into, finally, the intergovernmental conference, high-level meeting, which will take place in May next year at the General Assembly in New York, and a political declaration is expected to come out. So this is an extremely important opportunity. And with that, I would now like to give the floor to my co-chair, His Excellency Pak Suharyanto, to provide his opening remarks. You have the floor, sir.
Terima kasih Yang Mulia, yang terhormat para delegasi, hadirin sekalian. Pleno ini akan membahas kerangka kerja pembiayaan global dan tata kelola ekonomi makro, khususnya terkait dengan penanganan risiko dan pembangunan resiliensi, termasuk diantaranya adalah bagaimana fitur risiko dipertimbangkan pada sektor keuangan, di mana masih belum terinternalisasinya risiko yang telah teridentifikasi saat ini, dan risiko yang terproyeksi di masa depan secara memadai ke dalam pembiayaan sektor swasta dan sektor publik, seperti yang telah ditekankan dalam laporan penilaian ke-6 dari IPCC yang diterbitkan tahun ini. Dan yang kedua adalah bagaimana sektor finansial dapat dibuat lebih mudah untuk diakses dan terjangkau agar dapat digunakan dengan lebih baik untuk mengurangi risiko dan membangun resiliensi masyarakat. Banyak aspek dari sistem keuangan, kebijakan ekonomi makro, dan pembiayaan pembangunan serta iklim menjadi kontributor utama tercipta dan bertahannya unsur risiko dan bahaya yang dapat menimbulkan potensi ancaman mendasar bagi manusia dan ekosistem tempat kita bergantung. Meski telah ada kemajuan dengan semakin dipertimbangkannya isu adaptasi perubahan iklim sebagai salah satu tujuan sektor lingkungan dalam konteks produk dan layanan green economy, tetap saja ada kekhawatiran bahwa para investor tidak mempertimbangkan bagaimana investasi mereka bisa menciptakan keterpaparan dan kerentanan pada komunitas lokal, rantai pasokan, dan ekosistem, mengabaikan atau memisahkan investasi tersebut dari implikasi makroekonomi lanjutan. Di saat investasi di bidang pencegahan, pengurangan risiko, dan resiliensi sudah lebih jelas, rasionalisasi keuangan untuk pengurangan risiko banyak jenis ancaman bahaya masih terbatas. Faktor-faktor seperti fokus pada tujuan jangka pendek, batasan peraturan, kurangnya pemahaman, dan kurangnya inklusivitas yang memunculkan hambatan dalam pembuatan kebijakan. Situasi ini memerlukan reformasi dan penataan kembali sektor keuangan sejalan dengan penanganan risiko dan pembangunan resiliensi, di mana komitmen politik, penerimaan dan dukungan publik merupakan faktor penting dari semua opsi kebijakan yang tersedia. Elemen penataan kembali ini meliputi penggambaran ulang hubungan fundamental antara ekonomi dan lingkungan dan masyarakat, dan membuat kemajuan pada standar universal, terminologi, dan taksonomi yang saling terkait. Pemerintah Indonesia dan seluruh negara dan badan-badan pembiayaan nasional dapat mengambil manfaat dari peningkatan kapasitas dan pemahaman di bidang ini untuk menginternalisasi faktor-faktor negatif dari luar di banyak kegiatan ekonomi. Diperlukan praktik dan implementasi bagaimana menteri, regulator, dan pengawas keuangan dapat memberi insentif dan mengamanatkan pendekatan multibahaya untuk pengurangan risiko. Hal ini harus didukung dengan panduan yang disempurnakan terkait misalnya bagaimana mengintegrasikan risiko bencana ke dalam proses pengadaan, praktek akuntansi, serta dalam standar akuntansi internasional dan nasional. Demikian pula panduan tentang standar pinjaman alternatif dan dokumentasi terkait dengan pasar informal yang sangat penting. Sesi ini berupaya menciptakan kaitan dengan upaya yang sedang dilakukan oleh satuan tugas antar lembaga dalam hal pendanaan bagi pembangunan dan pendanaan bagi forum tindak lanjut tentang Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Untuk Midterm Review terdapat 5 pertanyaan. Yang pertama adalah progres apa saja yang telah diamati sejak tahun 2015 dalam hal pertama, integrasi pengurangan risiko multibahaya dalam investasi publik dan swasta, termasuk pendanaan pembangunan dan iklim. Kedua, pengembangan alat kebijakan dan peraturan untuk memastikan bahwa pengurangan dan pencegahan risiko di dalam investasi di semua jenis dan kelas aset. Untuk yang kedua, apa di dalam sistem ekonomi kita saat ini yang menghargai upaya mengeksternalisasi risiko dan mengeksploitasi sistem kehidupan, serta mencegah atau menghambat konsumsi dan produksi berkelanjutan. Ketiga, bagaimana lingkup penerapan pembelajaran sejak pengadopsian kerangka Sendai, Agenda 2030 dan Perjanjian Paris di tahun 2015 diaplikasikan untuk mengembangkan diskusi, melaksanakan penilaian risiko yang komprehensif, dan membuka pendekatan yang lebih holistik untuk menjawab risiko dan membangun resiliensi. Selanjutnya, poin-poinnya yang pertama, poin A adalah bagaimana risiko yang saat ini diabaikan menjadi lebih terintegrasi ke dalam proses pengadaan, praktek dan standar pencatatan keuangan. B, bagaimana pendekatan penilaian dan model penetapan harga yang lebih tepat dapat diterapkan pada eksploitasi kegiatan pertanian dan eksploitasi sumber daya alam dan tenaga kerja manusia oleh pelaku ekonomi yang dominan. Keempat, instrumen apa yang tersedia untuk least developed countries atau LDCs, Landlocked Developing Countries LDCs, dan Small Island Developing States SIDS agar bisa mengakses sumber daya baik dalam negeri maupun sistem keuangan global atau sistem multilateral global. Bagaimana portofolio utang dan pinjaman yang ada dapat lebih selaras dengan kerangka Sendai. Kelima, saat kita mencari metrik baru di luar PDB, apa faktor risiko dan peluang dalam memastikan bahwa signifikansi kontribusi alam untuk kesehatan dan kesejahteraan manusia diperlakukan sebagai perhatian utama dalam upaya menghindari terciptanya risiko baru dan manajemen risiko yang telah ada. Demikian yang bisa kami sampaikan. Selanjutnya kami persilahkan untuk co-chair saya yang terhormat Ibu Mami Mijutori, utusan khusus PBB untuk pengurangan risiko bencana, untuk mengambil alih lagi. Persilahkan untuk Ibu Mami Mijutori. Terima kasih.
I thank the head of the National Disaster Management Authority for his opening remarks. Now, the midterm review plenaries are open to all participants, as mentioned, of the global platform. Member states and representatives of all stakeholders are invited to provide their perspectives on progress on themes since the adoption of the Sendai Framework, identifying lessons learned and recommendations for actions in the period to 2030 in pursuing the outcome of the framework. Specific insights from the perspective of your country, region, domain, constituency, organizations are encouraged. Thank you to those who pre-registered for your planned intervention. We have had a lot of registrations, which is very encouraging. Please prepare your interventions on the basis of the provisional, and I say provisional because there may be alterations, speakers list published on the webpage and according to the instructions provided. For those who have not registered but want to request to intervene orally, you may do it in two ways. For those who are here in person, there are staff members of UNDRR who are in the room. Please find them, indicate your wish to intervene, and provide your name, organization, title, and briefly describe what you want to speak about. For those participating online, because we are very happy to have a lot of online participants also, please indicate your wish to intervene using the chat functions in Hopin and provide the same elements that I just mentioned. Now, where time allows, we will endeavor to accommodate all requests. However, I must say at the outset that this may be a bit of an impossible challenge. So, to this end, pre-registered CSOs are kindly requested to pick up their organization's tags from the entrance. However, please that, as I mentioned, you may not be able to. I will do my best. We will do our best. But there have been a lot of pre-registrations. Thank you all for that. As indicated in the guideline for participants for the plenaries, to maximize participation, and this is important, oral interventions are limited to a maximum of 3 minutes. And we will cut off the microphone after 30 seconds have passed after 3 minutes. And having said that, your full text of intervention, if it will be sent electronically to the Secretariat, it will be duly taken into consideration in the same way as any mentioning in the chat will be taken into due consideration for the global platform itself and for the midterm review process. We have also made available the option to provide written comments, as I mentioned, or submission during the plenary. And again, you can do this using the online chat function in Hopin, and by also in-person participants using the Slido app. So, I look forward to a fruitful exchange, and now I would like to open the plenary discussion. Now, I have the pleasure to give the floor to our keynote speaker today, Mr. Fabio Kakaribu, who is the head of the Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, very fit for today's topic. You have the floor, sir.
Distinguished delegates and guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by extending my warmest welcome to all of you. As the host of this forum, we are honored and pleased to deliver this keynote speech. As many of you are aware, this year we are in half of a journey through implementation of the Sendai Framework since 2015. I believe many countries have made good progress to implement the targets and priorities of the framework for action to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risks. However, we also see that there is still a lot of homework to be done until 2030 to achieve the fulfillment of all the commitments in the framework. The 7th Global Platform for disaster risk reduction takes place at a critical time. 7 years from the adoption of the Sendai Framework, just over 2 years since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and 1 year before the intergovernmental midterm review of the Sendai Framework scheduled for 2023. Throughout the Global Platform 22, member states and stakeholders at all relevant levels will review Sendai Framework implementation progress and achievement of disaster risk-related targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Distinguished co-chairs, guests, ladies and gentlemen, the global economy still faces several challenges and risks. With the current global dynamic, we all are aware that global and regional economic growth prospects seem to be lower than initially expected. We are facing a stronger challenge with the war in Ukraine after the previous global crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The uncertainty of the COVID-19 pandemic remains high, with the possibility of emergence of more virulent variant, while at the same time the imbalance in vaccine distribution remains high. Therefore, the pandemic remains a major challenge for the world economy. However, the global conditions have experienced encouraging developments, where the daily global COVID-19 cases have decreased significantly since the peak of Omicron variant back in mid-January. Many countries have eased social restrictions, opened up borders, and gradually transited to endemic phase, so that most countries have gained momentum for economic recovery since 2021. The global economic challenges and risks are more elevating, mainly due to the war in Ukraine. The war has become a severe humanitarian crisis and brought a tremendous impact on the global economy. OECD estimates the global economy will drop by 1 percentage point if the conflict is prolonged, and inflation increase by 2.5 percentage point. Similarly, IMF has lowered since 2022 global GDP growth outlook by 0.8 percentage point. Inflation outlook for advanced economy has been projected to increase by 1.8 percentage point, while in emerging market and developing economies increase by 2.8 percentage points. The economic sanctions imposed by major countries against Russia have put pressure on global trade. These pressures will create further supply disruption, which we have been experiencing since last year, and subsequently increase the inflationary pressure. Another risk that needs to be figured is the impact of monetary policy tightening to the global liquidity. The inflation pressure drove central bank in some countries to increase the interest rate since 2021. Due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022, the inflation trend has lengthened, and it accelerates central bank to tighten their monetary policy as well. Most of developed and developing countries have decided to increase the interest rate to deal with the rising prices, including the Fed announced 0.5 percentage point interest rate hike back in May. The impact of various actions in response to geopolitical crisis affect countries around the world, especially for lower income and poor countries. We have seen global commodity prices, including food and energy, soar, and additional impacts on global value chain. This has flown through the currency markets and economic stability, undermining many countries' previous recovery trajectories. The debt distress is lower in lower income and poor countries increased significantly due to the rise of global commodity prices. Meanwhile, climate-related macroeconomic risks are also important to be addressed to ensure an orderly, just, and affordable transition. The increased frequency and severity of climate-related disasters in recent years has highlighted the escalating economic, environmental, and social costs of climate change. Carbon emissions will continue to rise, and global growth will be increasingly affected by rising and more severe physical risk under a scenario of unchanged policy settings. A comprehensive policy package, including green supply policies on infrastructure, can still deliver growth and employment-friendly outcomes. Distinguished co-chairs, guests, ladies and gentlemen, the focus of the midterm review of Sendai Framework includes a prospective inquiry on how to better address risk and building resilience. The review will highlight the concepts to realize regenerative sustainable development. We are fortunate to have a midterm review of the implementation of the Sendai Framework at this time to discuss how to manage the challenging global situation. From country reporting overview in Sendai Framework Monitor, we can see that from 195 member countries, 133 countries not started, 54 countries in progress, 2 countries ready for validation, and 6 countries validated. We're still lacking in international cooperation and critical infrastructure and services targets. Therefore, we need to enhance our collaboration through this global platform to achieve the targets. Through consultations and review by states and other stakeholders, the review will assess progress in integrating disaster risk reduction into policies, programs, and investments at all levels, identify good practices, gaps, and challenges, and accelerate the path to achieving the goal of the Sendai Framework and its 7 global targets by 2030. Let me share Indonesia's experience on implementing disaster risk reduction. For Indonesia, several progress have been achieved in the last 7 years in addressing disaster risks. Regulations, technical guidance regarding disaster risk reduction have been issued. Regulation and guidance on building earthquake resistance house is one of the examples. We also integrated risk reduction into our spatial planning system to reduce mortality rate and casualties, as well as economic impact of disasters. We commit to strengthening our disaster data, improving the data collection, not only the coverage, but also the speed, its accessibility, as well as expanding the dissemination of the data and information. Numerous programs, activities were also conducted to improve the capacity of the subnational government, especially in developing their own disaster management plan. Several programs for the society to increase their awareness on disaster risk and increase their capacity, not only at the district level, but also to the village level. To mitigate risk, disaster risk, Indonesian government has established a disaster risk financing strategy, DRFI, and policy which contains a mix of instruments that have been implemented and new instruments to be developed. The strategy provides sufficient and sustainable funds for disaster risk financing, including establishment of a disaster pooling fund to strengthen the state budget, and the government transfer risk through insurance to finance disasters. The pooling fund is established to provide additional fund to complement the disaster contingent budget, the regular budget for disaster for the short term. But in the long term, we design it as a self-insurance tool against disaster risk. The pooling fund is managed by the Indonesian Environment Fund in order to strengthen the synergy between climate change action and risk reduction, since more than 90% of our natural disasters are hydrometeorology disasters like flood, landslide, drought, extreme weather, or typhoon. Pooling fund mobilizes fund, especially in pre-disaster stage, from national budget, subnational budget, and other resources such as private sectors, financial institutions, society, partner countries, and others. The fund will be used to finance disaster-related activities in pre-disaster, emergency, and post-disaster stage, including risk transfer by acquiring insurance product to protect public assets and our vulnerable people, such as farmers and fishermen. Through the DRFI strategy, we shift our disaster risk financing approach from a reactive to a more proactive one. It means that we try to be less dependent on national budget and more on other financing instruments. It also means that we commit to put more investment in pre-disaster activities. This is reflected as well as in the pooling fund programs. During its early operation, pooling fund will focus on accumulating fund and financing the mitigation, preparedness, and risk reduction program, including paying premium for public asset insurance. The risk transfer scheme is implemented through the implementation of state-owned property insurance and agricultural insurance. We started to insure our national assets since 2019. Insurance for government buildings, training centers, health facilities against disaster risk was the pilot project. As of today, we have already insured around 2,100 buildings of all line ministries with total insured value of $1.03 billion. We aim to insure all of our ministries and government institution building this year. Furthermore, we plan to expand the state asset insurance to cover other types of assets like roads, bridges, and other infrastructures. Subnational government is also expected to increase their role in disaster risk financing. They are invited to chip in the pooling fund for disaster and also encouraged to insure their assets. Through pooling fund, we will develop an incentive mechanism such as co-financing scheme to help the subnational insure their assets. Distinguished speakers, panelists, guests, ladies and gentlemen, this plenary is an excellent opportunity for governments around the globe, United Nations agencies, relevant non-state institutions, and global institutional stakeholders to engage and share their views on the progress of the framework implementation since the adoption. The forum also facilitates the collaboration within multi-stakeholders to examine changes in the context of the framework and other emerging issues since 2015, as well as the expectation to be adjusted in the period to 2030. We believe the midterm review that we are joining today will provide greater chances for all participants to discuss various problems and challenges affecting the contribution of each party and impacting the outcomes and goals of the Sendai Framework. Specifically, the challenges that we are experiencing in preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk, including its financing challenges. We recognize that many countries have gained economic recovery since beginning of the COVID-19 cases at the end of 2019. However, the pandemic challenges remain. Each government must undertake extraordinary responses to control health emergency and mitigating economic crisis. The measures led to more limited policy and budget spaces. Consequently, the policy options brought to a more complicated macroeconomic policy with the tighter global liquidity. On one hand, the economic recovery needs to be sustained. On the other hand, the upraised cost of fund has been constraining most of developing countries to access adequate financing resources. The global community requires each country to provide a well-planned and well-maintained economic policy aiming to realize financial stability and provide other safeguards amidst the potential severe risk and negative spillovers. In the context of Indonesia, the government employs a fundamental fiscal policy that plays essential roles as a shock absorber of various forthcoming risks, as well as a significant tool to oversee the development agenda. The government decides to continue promoting economic recovery policy, such as providing protection schemes to the most vulnerable people. More importantly, the government will endure the structural reforms to sustain future economic development. However, while the government's current focus is to prioritize the budget support for health and economic recovery, the disaster risk is also seizing the attention. Disaster risk is a growing threat to global development and prosperity for years. The consequences tend to be more severe in developing countries, affecting poor and marginalized people disproportionately. Considered as one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, Indonesia has an interest in advancing disaster management and risk reduction, both at the global and national level. The government of Indonesia prioritized strengthening its disaster resilience at the same time. The government has been striving to integrate disaster risk reduction into national development and investment plans. In addition, spending the state budget more on prevention stage has been one of the Indonesia's policy approaches to bring a better balance with spending on response and provide better protection to the people at risk. Challenges and disaster risk have contributed to shape Indonesia's policy concerning disasters to be inclusive, development-oriented, and treated as an investment. Indonesia's leadership in facing the increase in disaster risk is carried out through strategies for strengthening political commitments and community-based contribution, improving disaster literacy, as well as implementing adaptive policies in response to COVID-19 pandemic. Although there have been some advances in development of DRR strategies that are made during the pandemic situation, we recognize there are still challenges to managing the timing of the preparation of to support documents or data for disaster risk management, assessment, as well as financing that must be addressed comprehensively during this midterm review. Finally, on behalf of Minister of Finance, I acknowledge the efforts of all parties in integrating disaster risk reduction into policies, programs, and investments at all levels and stages. We are able to develop any international best practices, identify new and existing disparities, addressing challenges and obstacles, while accelerate the path to achieving the goal of the Sendai Framework and its global targets. It is important to accelerate closer cooperation between public and private sectors to tackle disaster risk reduction challenges. We need multilateral cooperation in mobilizing new disaster investment and funding sources for mitigation and risk reduction. Strong international cooperation and partnerships are fundamental elements in supporting global disaster risk reduction effort. Advancing cooperation between countries, both bilaterally and multilaterally, very crucial given the gap capacities, including the resources owned by each country. I hope the consultation and the discussion during the forum will also gather concrete steps to address the economic and capacity gap, including innovation, technology disparities between countries, related with the formulation and implementation of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies. Therefore, the trajectory of Sendai Framework's goals and target will be achieved on track. We believe that no single disaster risk reduction model works for all countries. Policy and relevant investment options should suit each country's specific needs under a comprehensive strategy. In this regard, we welcome any new transformative actions and innovations, as well as renewed approach to the development that is grounded on strategic foresight and reducing risk for future generations. We hope today's forum will be highly beneficial for all of us as a platform to discuss on the opportunities and challenges, as well as strengthen our commitment to improve progress implementation of the framework. To close my keynote address, allow me to re-emphasize my appreciation towards the meaningful collaboration between Government of Indonesia and the United Nations in conducting this forum. Thank you. I wish you all very constructive discussion.
I would like to thank Mr. Kakaribu for his excellent address, setting the tone for this session. Now, I will go directly into inviting interventions from the participants. In doing so, please indicate to which guiding question or question you are speaking to. And I would like to repeat that please restrict your intervention to 3 minutes. After 3 minutes and 30 minutes, we will be cutting off the microphone. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Olaya Dotel, Vice Minister of Economy, Planning and Development of the Dominican Republic. Madam, the floor is yours.
Muy buenas tardes. Para mi intervención me enfocaré en la pregunta número 4 sobre los instrumentos de financiamiento disponibles para los países menos adelantados, los países en desarrollo sin litoral y los pequeños estados insulares en desarrollo. Es sabido que a nivel global existen instrumentos financieros a los que este grupo de países puede acceder, pero hay que aclarar que son mayormente créditos y que aunque sean financiamientos con condiciones blandas, generan importante presión en las finanzas públicas internas de estos países. Actualmente, el el Banco Mundial tiene un amplio espectro de financiación de instrumentos de riesgos disponibles para ayudar a los prestatarios a planificar respuestas eficientes ante desastres naturales. Igualmente, el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo tiene una cartera de fondos para contingencias, solo por mencionar algunos de los instrumentos crediticios a nivel global y regional. En adición, existen otros fondos y seguros de desastres de carácter privado que también disponen recursos para disminuir el impacto fiscal de los desastres naturales en las economías, como el mecanismo de seguro contra riesgos catastróficos del Caribe. A lo interno de la República Dominicana existen mecanismos fiscales de respuesta ante desastres. Por ley se destina al menos el 1% del presupuesto nacional para la atención de emergencias, rehabilitación y reconstrucción de daños causados por desastres originados por fenómenos naturales. Por otra parte, se han creado fondos de respuesta ante emergencias para apoyar la reconstrucción y la respuesta ante desastres, como el Fondo Nacional de Prevención, Mitigación y Respuesta ante Desastres, además de la existencia de seguros agropecuarios y otros mecanismos de emergencia. Ahora, a partir del nuevo contexto de pospandemia, se hace necesario un cambio de visión de la financiación a la gestión del riesgo, tanto a lo interno de los países como en las estructuras globales. No podemos seguir invirtiendo solo en el manejo del desastre, en especial para regiones como el Caribe. Para nosotros la gestión de riesgo de desastre es una previsión al desastre. Estamos conscientes de que tendremos al menos una tormenta por año, por lo que nuestro enfoque debe ir hacia la disminución del impacto económico, social, ecológico y sobre todo salvar vidas. Por ello necesitamos un mecanismo de inversión que se amplíe más allá de las contingencias o las respuestas a la emergencia, mismo que siguen siendo extremadamente necesarios, pero también necesitamos inversiones que generen sostenibilidad y resiliencia a mediano y largo plazo. Un interesante ejemplo a nivel subregional fue el Fondo del Caribe, que se dedicará a atraer financiamiento a gran escala y de bajo costo para destinarlo a invertir en sectores verdes, a reducir la deuda mediante el encaje de esta por adaptación al clima y apoyar la inversión en proyectos que fomenten la resiliencia en las pequeñas economías insulares en desarrollo del Caribe, como en otras partes de América. Es imperativo que como comunidad internacional comencemos a pensar por fuera de la caja estos temas de reducción del riesgo de desastre en apoyo a los países menos desarrollados y sin recursos suficientes para hacer frente a estos, tomando en cuenta sobre todo inversiones que no necesariamente serán financieras, pero que contienen el potencial de generar un impacto en la reducción del riesgo de desastres. Por ejemplo, crear un marco definido para generar, duplicar y transferir tecnología de forma sostenible entre países, identificar.
I thank the Vice Minister of the Dominican Republic for her statement, and I would like to repeat that the written statement will be taking fully due into consideration. So I would like to next give the floor to Ms. Heidi Schroeder-Fox, the Acting High Representative of the UN Office of the High Representative for LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. Madam, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking the government and the people of Indonesia for the warm hospitality and the excellent arrangements for this important event. The topic of this conference is extremely important for the 91 most vulnerable countries that my office supports. Cascading crises have disproportionately hit the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing states. The pandemic, its socio-economic impacts, and a high degree of vulnerability to climate impacts and natural hazards have left these countries exposed. The energy and food price shocks resulting from the conflict in Ukraine are further impacting vulnerable nations, many of which are net importers of key food commodities. The pandemic has already left many countries in dire economic straits. Tourism has collapsed, exports are in decline, supply chains disrupted. They suffer from shrinking fiscal space and worsening debt situations. Of the 46 least developed countries, 22 are now in debt distress or at high risk. The debt service suspension initiative has provided some relief, but it has only postponed payments of debt service. A longer-term solution is needed. A solution that involves real debt relief, but which does not impact on credit ratings. And at the same time, innovative approaches are needed for new finance. For example, debt swaps for climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction must be used more often. The same applies to green and blue bonds. Disaster clauses should be integrated into new debt contracts. In order to address disaster risk reduction, LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS need additional finance which will not worsen their existing debt situations. The recently agreed Doha Programme of Action for the LDCs identifies key areas of action for disaster risk reduction, including strengthening multi-hazard early warning systems, operational national risk information systems, national statistical and planning offices for disaster loss data, climate resilience and risk-informed investment, as well as bilateral and multilateral support, and catastrophe-triggered financial instruments. The Doha Programme of Action serves as an important input to the Sendai Midterm Review. Similarly, there are important links between Sendai Midterm Review and the successor regimes of the Samoa Pathway for the SIDS and the Vienna Programme of Action for the landlocked countries. Preparatory processes for both new programs will begin this year. And finally, the whole question of finance, disaster risk reduction, and debt are closely linked with the process for preparing a multidimensional vulnerability index. The SIDS have long called for this, and it's high time for the international community to act on it. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Schroeder-Fox for her intervention, and I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Vijay Kumar, Executive Director of the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Madam Mami. It is a pleasure and privilege to submit our thoughts. We are a network of 1,436 organizations from across 127 countries. I'm actually putting forward the perspectives of all these organizations who have put together the thoughts and actually asked us to actually represent their thinking here. Let me start by saying that we know we have not been able to reduce the risk. Risk has instead increased. That means something that we have been doing for all these years have not been working. We have to think in an alternate way. And what is that alternate way? Which comes to some of the anecdotal evidence from across the globe suggests that listening to the communities, community-led processes have ensured there is success and sustainability, even if it is in an anecdotal level. Now, can we actually promote this? Who does this work? We actually see the civil society organizations who are local, who have that capacity, knowledge. They can facilitate the process of mobilizing the community and their views and ensuring the priorities that community is doing is informing the local planning processes and integrated in local planning processes to strengthen the resilience of the communities. But at the national level, then these processes are informing the policy formulation and practices. And at the global level, then we coordinate among the various global frameworks so that we collectively work with the community's perspectives, with the local actors' perspectives, our local institutions' perspective to strengthen the resilience of the communities. The second thing, we saw that thanks to UNDRR processes, which actually set up the stakeholder engagement mechanism. So it is an approach to include, to adopt an all-society approach, where all society need to come together to work communities and the community-based institutions, which can best be, again, convened and mobilized by the civil society organizations. Number three, I strongly feel it is essential to actually promote the localization as an approach, where not only we listen to the communities and the local actors, but locate the investment, locate the finance and the decision on the finance for the utilization and utilization in formulating the strategies and effective implementation of the program of the local level with those those institutions which are located at the local level are linked and supported from the national and global resources. And last but not the least, we have to adopt risk-informed development. Whatever we say, wherever we go, we need to talk of how risk is analyzed and how risk is informing our current engagement. That is what I will be submitting on behalf of our members of GNDR. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, BJ, for your statement. And now I would like to hand the moderation to my co-chair.
Terima kasih Miss Mami Wijotori. Sekarang saya akan memberikan kesempatan untuk Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Mr. Sukri Ahmed. Dipersilahkan.
Thank you, Chair. I would try to answer questions 1 and 3. Since the adoption of the Sendai Framework, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, together with national and international partners, has supported over 40 countries to mainstream multi-hazard risk reduction in agriculture in the sectoral development plan and budgeting processes. This has contributed to enhance national risk governance systems and ensuring linkages and alignments between sectoral and national and local DRR strategies and plans. Working with countries, FAO has supported the implementation, adoption, and uptake of disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and climate smart agriculture good practices at farm and landscape levels. FAO also has supported countries to conduct several studies where to check the returns on investment to make the case. For instance, in 2019, a study revealed that investment into risk-reducing farm level DRR practices actually performed 2.2 times better than the previously put practices. FAO also supports the strengthening of 50 countries to conduct multi-hazard risk and vulnerability assessments and resilience analysis in agriculture and food security to inform the delivery of development and humanitarian actions on the ground. Support also has been provided to countries to strengthen global, regional, national, and local level food security early warning systems and analysis. We have supported over 95 countries to strengthen disaster and food security risk-related early warning systems and has rolled out multi-hazard risk-informed anticipatory actions. Scaling up disaster risk financing should be undertaken through the development of innovative multi-risk financing models to boost and accelerate the implementation of the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, including in agri-food systems. This includes, among others, the development and scale-up of risk transfer mechanisms. In addition, there is a need to develop and promote new and proven approaches to really create a shift from reactive response to proactive risk management. Moreover, new proactive risk management approaches need to be validated through return on investment studies to help provide insights into the cost-benefit ratio in order to better understand whether these approaches are value for money and lead to the economic, social, and environmental benefits that are much needed to provide people with sustainable and resilient livelihoods. I thank you.
Terima kasih banyak Mr. Sukri Ahmad atas tanggapan Anda, dan saya sekarang akan memberikan kesempatan kepada African Forum for International Relations in Research and Development Uganda, Mr. James Wawanda. Dipersilahkan.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, Chair and Co-Chair, delegates, and all participants. From the African perspective, as other speakers have said, the risks are enormous and substantially destructive. In that regard, the international community and all stakeholders should come together to assist the developing countries, and in particular Africa, where I come from. First of all, there's a problem. As we reduce risks, we have to forego some resources. Has anyone imagined that the newly discovered resources like oil is going to become obsolete because you have to leave it in the ground? In this case, there's a risk of increased poverty, there's a risk of social unrest, and there's a risk of chaos as poverty increases. However, there are opportunities: clean air, less diseases, sustainable ecosystems, and climate resilient communities. So in this case, my campaign is, first of all, to lobby for early warning systems or mechanisms from the international community so that we can reduce on the risks involved. Secondly, of course, the resources needed are enormous and the risks are substantially discussed before. Can we target capacity building right from institutions, communities, and the local authorities so that once the communities know what to do, how to do it, and when, with the help of technology like early warning systems, possibly we can reduce the risks. Lastly, I'd like to thank the organizers, the government of Indonesia, the UN and its agencies, and the entire organizing committees for this opportunity, for organizing this forum, the conference, and giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih banyak Mr. James Mawanda atas tanggapan Anda. Dan sekarang saya akan memberikan kesempatan untuk dari Papua New Guinea, Mr. Alhassane Berry. Dipersilakan.
Merci à l'UNEDER. Je vais devoir présenter le cas de la Guinée. La Guinée figure aujourd'hui parmi de nombreux pays confrontés au risque de catastrophe. Elle a déjà enregistré plusieurs cas, notamment les inondations, les incendies, les épidémies, les incendies et les cas d'éboulement. Les problèmes de catastrophe interpellent tous les acteurs aujourd'hui. Nombreux sont les structures différentes qui interviennent dans le processus de gestion des catastrophes en Guinée, notamment les services publics, le secteur privé, la société civile, les institutions nationales et internationales. Le gouvernement et les partenaires ont fait des efforts dans le cadre de la prévention et réduction des risques de catastrophes. Cela se traduit par les multiples réformes et programmes engagés par différents ministères impliqués dans le processus de prévention et gestion des risques de catastrophes. Malgré ces efforts, les défis à relever sont encore très nombreux, ce qui nécessite une synergie d'action de façon coordonnée, participative, complémentaire et inclusive. C'est dans ce cas qu'une série d'actions pour la mise en cadre, pour la mise en œuvre du cadre d'action de Sendai a été entreprise. Les progrès observés sont les suivants. Depuis la dernière plateforme mondiale pour la RRC tenue en 2019, la Guinée a enregistré des progrès significatifs dans la mise en œuvre du cadre de Sendai. Les principales réalisations sont les suivantes. L'élaboration et la validation de la plateforme nationale de réduction des risques de catastrophes en 2018, à l'accompagnement de la CEDEAO, élaboration de la stratégie nationale et du plan stratégique de la réduction des risques de catastrophes, élaboration d'une application pour le système d'information, de surveillance et d'alerte précoce. La mise en place des points focaux et des comités de veille régionaux, préfectoraux et communaux de gestion des catastrophes pour un meilleur suivi de la mise en œuvre du cadre de Sendai. L'établissement d'une cartographie dynamique des risques de catastrophes dans le pays. La formulation d'un programme d'action visant à mettre en place une base de données sur les catastrophes survenues dans le pays. Nous avons des défis. Les défis sont la faiblesse des capacités institutionnelles et l'absence de cadre juridique constituent des obstacles à la mise en œuvre effective du cadre de Sendai. L'investissement financier limité dans la réduction des risques de catastrophes reste un défi majeur. Malgré les développements positifs en termes de partenariat et de financement de divers partenaires existants. Cela a été exacerbé par la situation politique du pays. Vous allez vous rappeler avec les manifestations politiques et l'émergence de la pandémie. En cela, il y a aussi le renforcement des capacités des cadres, la mobilisation des ressources et l'opérationnalisation de la plateforme nationale. La priorité, c'est au niveau de la gouvernance. Et on a besoin que le Centre national de catastrophes trouve important de développer des stratégies au sein de l'Union africaine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Hassani Bari, for your intervention. And now I would like to give the floor to my co-chair, Ms. Mami Wijotori. You have the floor, madam, please.
Thank you very much, Sir Co-Chair. So I would like to give the floor next to Mr. Kus Wierix, Chairman of the Governing Board of UN IGRAC. The floor is yours, sir.
The International Groundwater Resources Assessment Center under the wings of UNESCO. And I want to present the issue of groundwater as a new emerging issue, as a potential disaster, but at the same time as a solution for other disasters, for the health crisis, for the food crisis, for the water crisis, and for drought issues. Groundwater provides 50% of the global drinking water, 40% of the water for irrigation, 30% for energy. Groundwater sustains nature, biodiversity. Groundwater is the regulator for the global water cycle. And still, it is invisible in our policies, and it's unknown to our policymakers. Groundwater is being polluted. Groundwater is being over-extracted. And you can see in Indonesia and Jakarta, for instance, the result, sinking cities at the coastline. Groundwater is not well managed. We do not have enough data, and we are lacking cooperation. And with more demand for water, climate change, and a decreasing water quality, the problems may only get worse. IGRAC is collecting data, is preparing groundwater maps, is helping in capacity building, is stimulating cooperation, and supporting better management. And I have 5 messages for groundwater in this special International Year for Groundwater in 2022. One is demystify groundwater presentation. Understand the complexity and make the invisible visible. 2, stimulate awareness and unlock the potential for climate change adaptation. 3, connect the groundwater world with the surface water world. Join hands with other sectors like drinking water, agriculture, industry, and energy. 4, improve groundwater management with a fair allocation. In December this year, we will have a special groundwater summit in Paris, organized by UNESCO and IGREC. And in March 2023, we'll have the UN Water Conference. Let's make groundwater visible at these conferences. Let's prevent further disasters, and let's use the potential of groundwater to solve other problems, to help the poor, and to realize several SDG goals. And UN IGREC is ready to help. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Wedix for your intervention, for your comment, and I would now like to invite Ms. Rui Kotani, Disaster Risk Reduction Coordinator of the Group on Earth Observations. The floor is yours, Madam.
Thank you. So Earth observation technology is rapidly advancing, and new tools and applications is being developed to support governments to make evidence-based decisions across key sectors to contribute DRR, climate actions, and SDGs. And my intervention's in response to question 1, by the way. So, for example, freely accessible Earth observation data is a high-resolution solar atlas of Egypt, which is monthly produced maps with solar irradiation and photovoltaic power potential in the country. This has empowered Egyptian authorities to plan future national investments to and the efficient exploitation of solar energy. This is like implementing mitigation and adaptation targets in the power sector in the integrated sustainable energy strategy of that country to 2035. We hope to promote this sort of work. Particularly useful, I think, is Earth observation data on land data to assess human settlements and movement, as well as land exposure to floods, landslides, and other hazards. We can leverage such data, for example, to better locate toilets by the humanitarian development agencies. In this way, water sanitation hygiene services can be more climate resilient and they are relevant, and the investment is better allocated. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Kotani for her statement, and now would like to invite Her Excellency Ms. Marina Berg, Ambassador to Indonesia of Sweden. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Mami Mitsuturi, and thank you to UNDRR and the Indonesian government for organizing and hosting this session and this event these days. Indeed, we have much to learn from my home country, Indonesia, when it comes to disaster risk reduction. Let me give you 4 aspects on question 2. First of all, there has been a lot of work done within environmental economics, not the least by the World Bank, to fine-tune measurements of economic development to internalize mainly environmentally related externalities. That is adjusted net savings, etc. This work can be expanded to include non-environmental risk externalities. Secondly, the lack of measures to value and price global public goods such as clean water, clean air, biodiversity, and other nature-based risk-reducing solutions continues to be a problem. work to measure such public goods and internalize them into national and global fiscal systems would not only be welcome, it is a must. For this, we need political will and leadership, wisdom and expertise, as always. Thirdly, climate change is one key example of failure of the global community to internalize into national systems. External costs of emissions, national emissions accounting needs to include extra national emissions. For example, emissions arising from in-country consumptions. Fourthly, accountability and transparency in public as well as in private investments is critical to minimize external risks and costs. Also, to build public trust in governance and institutions. If no public trust in governance, there will be no way to value measure price on global public goods. Thank you very much.
I thank Ambassador Berg for her intervention, for her statement. Thank you very much. And now I pass the floor to my co-chair, Pak Suharyanto.
Terima kasih, Ms. Mami Mujutori. Berhubung saya akan menghadiri sesi lainnya, perkenan saya menyerahkan co-chair 2 sesi pleno ini kepada Yang Mulia Febrian A. Rudiat, Wakil Tetap Indonesia untuk PBB, WTO, dan organisasi lainnya di Jenewa. Terima kasih.
Now I would like to invite Ms. Fatma Lestari from Disaster Risk Reduction Center of University of Indonesia. She's the Director, Disaster Risk Reduction Center of University of Indonesia. You have the floor, Ms. Lestari.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We deeply appreciated Indonesia National Disaster Management Agency under the leadership of Legend TNI Suharyanto. Indonesia are very honored to host this extremely important global platform for DRR. In order to achieve the Sendai Framework goals, such as to reduce disaster mortality, in the context of Indonesia, as Mr. Fabrian mentioned from Indonesian Ministry of Economic in his keynote speech, we would like to endorse a strong commitment from all stakeholders by implementing pentahelix approach from the academia, government, industry, community, and media. All the leaders and their stakeholders need to have a strong commitment on DRR, including by investing in DRR. Indeed, to further reduce the mortality from disaster, we develop earthquake resilience based on local wisdom and environmental friendly. Indonesia has a strong culture and local wisdom, such as in Lombok, West Nusa Tenggara. We witnessed that traditional houses in Senaru and Sasak houses, there were no damage during a strong earthquake there. In addition, to implement pooling fund, to make this become reality, we need to empower civil society through small-medium enterprise, so they become independent and as an economic driver, such as what has been implemented in Tourism Village for economic recovery post-pandemic COVID-19. As well as building a supply chain amongst them and providing multiplier effect. And the last part, data to implementing policy. For example, we support Ministry of Home Affairs writing several guidelines in collaboration with Indonesia Disaster Management Agency. from local to global. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lestari, for the intervention. Now I would like to invite Mr. Cristian Eduardo Torres Bermeo, Director General for Risk and Emergency Management from Ecuador. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Greeting to all assistants. I'm referring to the fifth question. As we continue witnessing the evolution of well-known hazards in our territories and the appearance of new hazards, the synergy between climate change and adaptation and risk reduction must become a high priority in the global platform for disaster risk reduction and the COPE, to ensure that nature's contribution to human health and well-being are treated as central in avoiding the creation of new risks and management of existing ones. Governments must update regulations according to the new needs identified in the scientific evidence and also the forecasting. Strengthen the scientific institutions in order to open the scope of their investigations to the new priorities identified. Update their national and local agendas to include the new priorities and anticipatory actions to reduce not only the impact of disasters, but also creating new conditions that generates new risks. In Ecuador, based on the evaluation of macroeconomic damages and losses due to COVID-19, our country is working on the recovery strategy articulation development plan. It revolves around five main axes: health inequities, healthy behaviors, health prevention to reduce preventable illnesses and avoidable deaths. Meanwhile, the fourth axis is related to the access, efficiency, and quality of health services through the strengthening of first-level care networks, and a fifth axis focused on the improvement of coordination and the financing mechanisms of the health system with a view to efficiency, access, and universal coverage. This strategy also becomes a tool for local planning, which allows the opportunity to plan in two ways, both from local to the national and from the national to the local, with an annual evaluation period. The fourth axis, dedicated to the access, efficiency, and quality of health services through the strengthening of first-level care networks, we ensure that the approachness to the basic level of attendance, including the relationship between local medical centers with risk reduction local committees, as a prevention measure and first response in extreme events. These actions contribute to the accomplishment of the Safe Hospitals policy. This is an example of the need and implementation of the updates needed in the national planification that ensures contribution on human health is treated as central. With the transversalization of risk management in the national development plans and in the other planning tools, we contribute to avoid the creation of new risks and also increase the levels of response in case of extreme events, every day more common in our nation. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Bermeo for the intervention, and now I would like to invite Ms. Stephanie Durand from Canada. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you. First, let me just take a moment to just congratulate the government of Indonesia and UNDRR for the convening of this very important global platform. The government of Canada also recognizes that least developed countries and small island developments are increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate-related disasters. Canada remains committed to investing in resilience mechanisms that allow vulnerable countries to prepare for and mitigate the impacts of these events and rebuild from disasters. For example, Canada is working with the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency to strengthen the regional response capacity because we recognize that the small island states of the Caribbean can often be completely devastated by one event, and it is their nearest neighbors who can respond first. Internationally, Canada doubled its international climate finance commitment to $5.3 billion over 5 years, from 2021 to 2026, to support developing countries to low carbon, climate resilient, nature positive, and inclusive sustainable development. While collectively we have made important progress since the launch of the Sendai Framework, we must continue to take bold, ambitious steps to build resilient communities. The expansion of disaster risk reduction must take place at the community, regional, national, and international levels in order to ensure meaningful participation of the most vulnerable, especially women and children and indigenous peoples, as they are key partners and powerful agents of change. We know that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by disasters and are key actors in building resilience. This is a core principle of our feminist international assistance policy. Through our work with the Red Cross, United Nations Development Program, and many other partners, we are ensuring women's participation in decision-making and empowering women and girls through gender equality and national climate change adaptation and resilience action. Canada also recognizes that financial access can be a barrier for effective disaster risk reduction. To address this, Canada has been supporting a range of tools for vulnerable economies, such as climate risk insurance through the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Assessment and Financing Initiative, and the African Risk Capacity to provide rapid payouts following national disasters. By working together, we can build communities that are safer and are more resilient for generations to come. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegates of Canada for her remarks. Now I would like to pass over the chairmanship to my co-chair, Ms. Mitsutori. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Sharon Bhagawan-Rolls, Regional Manager of Shifting the Power Coalition, Pacific. The floor is yours, Madam.
Chairs and delegates, all protocols observed. A structural and transformative change is needed in financing models to enable the realization of gender equality and women's rights and secure and protect biodiversity, climate justice and resilience, and disaster risk reduction. Member States, as duty bearers as well as financial institutions, must center the expertise, lived realities and solutions of frontline communities, including Indigenous peoples, informal workers, rural communities, people with disabilities, non-binary and LGBTQ+ people and young women. This will ensure the full, equal, effective and meaningful participation, representation and leadership of women, including those in diverse situations and conditions at all levels of relevant climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction decision-making bodies and processes. We call for Member States to build on and localize the agreed conclusions of the 66th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women as part of the midterm review process through a movement-led approach that addresses structural root causes of gendered inequalities in decision-making, provide an enabling environment for self-organization that promotes collective agency and facilitates simplified direct access to financing. We also call for ensured connections with decision-making processes at national level, including parliaments, ensuring that natural resource governance, pandemic and climate processes have dedicated space for representatives of women's networks and feminist movements, especially those representing marginalized groups, and that processes are designed for effective sharing and listening, including capacity strengthening, translation, facilitation, and more. And we further call for dedicated resources for feminist funding models that are centered in the leadership of women's rights and feminist networks. Acknowledging that most climate financing is not gender transformative, very little reaches women's rights organizations on the ground, it's vital to revamp financing flows. The midterm review process is an opportunity to build on existing feminist funding models that already provide gender-responsive delivery mechanisms to support and enhance direct access to finance for grassroots women's organizations, Indigenous peoples and local communities, along with equitable and transparent monitoring of funding streams to support adaptive capacity and resilience of communities. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Bhagwan Rose for her intervention. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Elham Yousufian of International Disability Alliance. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. On behalf of the International Disability Alliance and participants with disabilities in this event, I want to thank the UNDRR and the government of Indonesia for organizing this event and for all the efforts that have been taken to make sure that the event is inclusive of and accessible for persons with disabilities. Unfortunately, 7 years after the Sendai Framework, the progress in inclusion of persons with disabilities in disaster risk reduction is not so positive. I want to highlight 3 main areas that require immediate action to ensure that by 2030 we have better news to share. First of all, unfortunately, data on persons with disabilities, the impact of disasters on persons with disabilities, the amount of finance being dedicated to disability-inclusive DRR, the participation of persons with disabilities in DRR decision-making, and other aspects of disaster risk reduction and disaster management is not collected on a systematic, disaggregated way. So even when we want to report why we are not included and how we are not included, we don't find enough data to rely on. And this is the indication of the systematic exclusion which is happening at this point. The second area that I want to highlight is finance. Unfortunately, there is no systematic finance dedicated to disaster risk reduction inclusive of persons with disabilities. However, we need this to happen in 2 levels. Dedication of specific funding for inclusion of persons with disabilities in DRR, which means programs and projects specifically designed to address barriers such as environmental, communicational, attitudinal, and institutional barriers faced by persons with disabilities to be included in disaster risk reduction. On the top of the specific finance, it is required to mainstream disability inclusion in DRR financing. Donors, those countries who dedicate finance to disaster risk reduction are at best placed to ensure that no project on DRR is being implemented without disability angle. It is important that when designing the indicators outline of projects, they make sure that indicators on disability inclusion is added to the plan. And that's the best way to guarantee that when disasters happen, the number of persons with disabilities losing their lives is reduced, and the impact of disasters on livelihoods of persons with disabilities is not so devastating. The third area that I wish to discuss is participation of persons with disabilities.
I thank Ms. Yousufian for her statement, and I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Kozo Nagami, Deputy Director General of the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Mr. Nagami, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. We, JICA, put a high importance of pre-disaster investment in DRR as reflected in Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, as all of you should have in your bags and pockets all the time. And estimate the necessary amount of DRR investments to be $30 billion annually at least, which equals to 80% of the economic losses in the developing countries. That is our estimation. And considering such huge amount of required DRR investment, we have to mobilize variety of available financing schemes that can be basically categorized into three types of financing: public, private, and public-private partnership. We have to employ financial measures depending on the expected disaster risk reduction purposes. Each of them has a specific advantage and disadvantage in nature. The most important thing is that we have to keep in our mind that private finance cannot always be replaced by, private finance cannot always replace public finance in particular. The current trends in increasing climate risk by climatic hazards are further requiring the public interventions and investments to reduce the disaster risk with minimizing hazard exposure, such as floods and storms. Public financing, especially targeting disaster risk reduction infrastructures, remains insufficient in many developing countries, and this should not be undermined as results of placing increased weight on the private sector investment. Thank you. That's it.
I thank Mr. Nagami for his statement, and now would like to pass the floor to my co-chair.
Thank you, Ms. Mitsutori. Now I would like to invite Ms. Saini Yang from Beijing Normal University. You have the floor, Ms. Yang.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. From the experience of China, we observe that strong and systemic governance is one key to disaster risk reduction. So this is regarding to the question 1. And I still remember the slogan of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction 2 years ago is, "It's all about governance." In China, we have witnessed the change brought by strong political will, mainstreaming DRR in the National Plan, Development Plan, and taking an integrated disaster risk governance approach. So in 2018, the central government of China announced 9 national projects on DRR as a package plan, which include national disaster risk assessment, ecological protection and recovery, coastal protection and recovery, seismic reinforcement, flood prevention, drought hazard prevention and relocation, building all levels emergency response centers and early warning systems, as well as ITCs, and also promote disaster prevention technologies and equipment modernization. So this is a systemic package plan involve huge investment into the economic system. At the same time, this covers the multi-hazard approach and also the whole process of DRM. And these national projects greatly improve the effectiveness of DRR work in China. And then in Sendai Framework, we have 3 key indicators, which are the number of deaths and missing persons, number of direct affected people, as well as the direct economic loss attributed to disasters. And from the change of these indicators, we basically can see the overall DRR progress of a nation or region. And in China, the number of deaths and missing people and the portion of direct economic loss during 2016 to 2020, which is after the Sendai Framework, declined by 37.6% and 38.9% when compared with those numbers during 2011 to 2015. So in the past 20 years, we have seen a very clear trend of reduced affected people per million people. So again, at this important moment of this midterm review of Sendai Framework, we just want to emphasize that the importance of strong political wills on DRR and the importance of embedded DRR into the overall national development plan. This will be the key to the successful implementation of Sendai Framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yang, for the intervention. Now I would like to invite Dr. Lena Dominelli from International Association of Schools of Social Work. You have the floor, Ms. Dominelli. My apology for that. Ms. Dominelli is not available. Now I will like to invite Ms. Nasin Mahtani from Yayasan Peta Bencana or Disaster Map Foundation. You have the floor, Ms. Mahtani.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Drawing from our experience as a local NGO developing tools that enable greater public participation in the co-management of disasters, we will be speaking towards questions 2, 3, and 5. Our intervention calls for greater support of open source tools and technology for climate adaptation within a planetary health framework as a complement to the Sendai Framework. Investments in climate change adaptation must be towards open source, open access tools with robust, reliable networks for sharing these tools and technologies. Vaccine patents have failed the Global South, and this failure of patenting cannot be repeated as we address the climate emergency. Sustainable development must recognize the right for all countries to have equal access to the scientific knowledge and tools that are needed to adapt and mitigate risk. Open source tools foster invaluable lateral exchange and enable us to address global challenges collectively, making far more effective use of investments and resources. Investments for climate adaptation must be and remain open source to enable equitable, democratic participation and increased cooperation on technology development, transfer, and maintenance. Second, to ensure that nature's contributions to human health and well-being are treated as central, we must adopt a planetary health framework by strongly implementing the integration of social and health sciences into all environmental, economic, and risk management. Within this framework, a more comprehensive repricing of risk would account for externalities of impacts on biodiversity and well-being calculated for at least the next 7 generations. Importantly, the parameters of this risk repricing be developed with indigenous and local communities with local knowledge integrated into risk assessments. These measures must be coupled with legally binding corporate transparency on measures that contribute to and mitigate risk. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Mahtani for the intervention. Now I would like to invite Mr. Carlos Picado Roas from Costa Rica. You have the floor, sir.
Bien, buenas tardes a todos. Bueno, primero creo que podemos compartir plenamente mucho de lo que se ha señalado. Yo quiero referirme a la pregunta 5, relacionada con el tema del financiamiento. Voy a comentar que en el caso de Costa Rica, en el marco normativo que nos rige, se establece como responsabilidad de todas las instituciones del sector público la asignación de recursos presupuestarios para la temática de gestión de riesgo, y recientemente también hemos incluido el de la adaptación. Con sustento en eso existe un Plan Nacional de Gestión de Riesgo, también obligado por ley, y el fundamento de la presupuestación y la planificación por parte de las instituciones es ese plan. Esto lo traigo acá justamente porque una de las observaciones que tenemos es de notar cómo en las discusiones a nivel internacional alrededor del tema gestión de riesgo se hace mención a la creación de fondos y de fuentes de cooperación internacional. Nosotros creemos firmemente que el tema, la gestión de riesgo, tiene que ser también resuelto como una responsabilidad propia que debe estar integrada directamente en la planificación y en el presupuesto que desarrollan los países. Dicho de otra manera, el planteamiento y el enfoque de desarrollo que el país tiene es el punto de partida para que la gestión de riesgo se haga efectiva. Y igual reiterar que todos los esfuerzos que hace el país siempre los hemos tenido como un ejercicio piloto en el cual deseamos compartir nuestras experiencias y además de eso apropiar lo que Naciones Unidas siempre ha venido proponiendo alrededor de cómo hacer mejor la temática de gestión de riesgo. Quiero con eso también entonces agradecer el aporte que Naciones Unidas siempre ha hecho a los esfuerzos que nuestro país ha generado alrededor del tema. Gracias.
I thank Mr. Rojas for the intervention. Now I pass the floor to my co-chair. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Entonces, quiero dar la palabra al señor Oscar Estuardo Cosío Cámara, secretario ejecutivo de la Coordinación Nacional para la Reducción de Riesgo de Desastres de Guatemala. Señor Estuardo Cosío Cámara, usted tiene la palabra.
Buenas tardes, muy agradecido, copresidenta. Aprovechar para agradecer siempre al gobierno de Indonesia por poder ser la sede de esta plataforma regional que es de mucho beneficio a nivel global. Un saludo para todas las delegaciones acá presentes y poder indicar que mi intervención está orientada a la respuesta de la pregunta número 1 y poder abordar que la inversión de la reducción de riesgo de desastres reviste de mucha importancia para asegurar que se minimicen las pérdidas ante la ocurrencia de un desastre y que no se vea afectado el desarrollo de un país ante las pérdidas ocasionadas por los mismos. El informe de evaluación regional sobre el riesgo de desastres en América Latina y el Caribe afirma que el patrón de riesgo de desastres en la región se está viendo seriamente influenciado por los efectos del cambio climático. En tal sentido, es importante resaltar que se deben de tomar medidas que aseguren la inversión pública y fortalezcan la resiliencia para estar preparados ante un evento catastrófico. Diversos estudios a lo largo del tiempo han demostrado que por cada dólar invertido en preparación se pueden ahorrar hasta $8 en la parte de recuperación ante un desastre. Derivado de esto, Guatemala ha desarrollado una serie de mecanismos que impulsan la protección en las inversiones públicas y fortalecen la resiliencia a través de distintos instrumentos y estrategias como la implementación de las normas de reducción de desastres, las cuales son un conjunto de especificaciones técnicas que tienen como principal objetivo ser un mecanismo de preservación de la vida, seguridad e integridad de las personas, estableciendo los requisitos mínimos que deben de cumplir las edificaciones e instalaciones a las cuales tienen acceso los diferentes usuarios. Actualmente existen 4 normas de reducción de desastres, las cuales abarcan requerimientos estructurales ante los eventos socioorganizativos y normas mínimas de seguridad en edificaciones e instalaciones de uso público. Adicionalmente, es importante resaltar el compromiso del Estado de Guatemala en la actualización de la Política Nacional de Reducción de Riesgo de Desastres, la cual incluirá una alineación a los instrumentos internacionales. La actualización de la Política Nacional de Reducción de Riesgo de Desastres también se orientará a la creación de mantenimiento de estrategias financieras a nivel sectorial y local, fomentando la asignación constante de recursos a través de la creación de partidas presupuestarias relativas al tema y que considere además la protección financiera de la inversión mediante la adquisición de seguros que garanticen la transferencia del riesgo. Ampliando lo demás, la protección del patrimonio cultural, institucional y de colección con el Guatemala cuenta y que reconozca la adaptación, resiliencia y sostenibilidad a favor de la población guatemalteca. En esta ocasión no puedo dejar de mencionar el apoyo de la cooperación internacional que ha sido de mucho valor para el país. Sin duda, aún existe un largo camino por recorrer en el fortalecimiento de estrategias financieras, pero gestionando la inversión de una manera adecuada fortalece el desarrollo de los estados y consecuentemente se reduce el riesgo de desastres. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, señor Oscar Estuardo Cosío Cámara. Before giving the floor to the next speaker, I wanted to mention that some of our pre-registered people are having connection problems, etc. So those who have not registered but would like to speak against today's theme around financing disaster risk reduction, please do find one of our colleagues who are in the room to let them know of your interest to make an intervention if you so wish. So I would like to go to the next speaker, Mr. Olfato, Political Officer of the Permanent Mission to the United Nations of the Philippines. Mr. Olfato, you have the floor.
co-chairs, excellencies, and colleagues, the Philippines believes that DRR financing should be institutionalized in development plans, which can be the basis that can inform how relevant actors will divert resources accordingly. In the Philippines, a national DRRM fund is allocated at national and local levels, including through initiatives such as catastrophe funds, insurance pooling, policy loans, insurance facilities, among others. DRR investments should be an integral part of broad socio-economic planning, taking into consideration the whole governance ecosystem, including preparedness and resilience, and linking them with anticipatory actions and social protection. Beyond resource allocation, a uniform understanding of financing guidelines should cascade from top to bottom, from national to local communities. Risk and multi-hazard mapping and planning should be supported by financing, while at the same time, finance, resource, and investments should be informed by risk. We highlight the criticality of bridging the gaps between science and technology and policy planning. There should be more financial support for innovations and indigenous knowledge that are reliable, functional, useful at all levels, and preserves the active role of communities. In the Philippines, we rolled out GeoRisk PH platform that aims to transform risk information to enhancing resilience. Beyond national development plans and initiatives, we should continue to provide and encourage financial support for organizations and initiatives that explores the nexus of DRR and humanitarian issues, displacement, and climate change. Support for such initiative deserve the attention of governments and the private sector. I thank you, co-chairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olfato. I would like to now give the floor to Dr. Lena Dominelli, Director of the International Association of Schools of Social Work, who is joining us virtually. Dr. Dominelli, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and I am delighted to be here addressing you just for a few moments. And dear colleagues and your excellencies and everyone else, I am just so glad we have the opportunity to argue for financing. And the angle I want to take follows on nicely from the previous speaker, because I speak as a community development worker linked to social workers. And our experience is in communities that have not got enough money. And we cannot talk about climate change and disaster preparedness, mitigation, adaptation without getting financing into these communities. The communities have to have substantial financing that they actually control so that it goes to the household level. And that's the key issue that I want to focus on. Households are the ones that spend the money, that give the labor, and that work very, very hard to try and make a good life for their children, themselves, and their extended families and those they care for. So please, please do give substantial sums of money to finance development that helps people to prepare, to prevent, and to mitigate. So renewable energies, for example. Poor people can't afford to buy those themselves. But if the finance were made available at the household level, they could, and then they would make a major contribution. And this applies across all countries, not just those in the global south, although they are in more need than poor people in rich countries. But I represent everyone in social work, so I speak on behalf of all of those poor communities. Thank you very much.
Dr. Dominelli, and I would like to pass the floor to my co-chair.
Thank you, co-chair. And now I would like to invite Mr. Milin Pimprikar, chairman of the Canis organization. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, co-chairs.
So, co-chairs and distinguished delegates, I will be addressing the intervention for guiding question number 5. The risk and opportunities of ensuring that nature's contributions to human health and well-being are treated as central in avoiding the creation of new risk and the management of existing risk. Co-chairs, the ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, ECO-DRR, offers unique opportunities for the sustainable management, conservation, and restoration of ecosystems to reduce disaster risk with the aim to achieve sustainable and resilient development. Out of the 4 priorities of the Sendai Framework, priority 1 and 3 recognize the importance of ecosystems in DRR. Well-managed ecosystems act as natural infrastructure, reducing physical exposure to many hazards and increasing socioeconomic resilience of people and communities by sustaining local livelihood. Mr. Co-chairs, although indigenous communities have in-depth knowledge of the ecosystem they inhabit, the current scenario due to climate change and systematic risk calls for complementing to their knowledge based on scientific understanding of ecosystems. Thus, such integrated approach provides evidence-based information on the indications of the levels of the health of ecosystems and human well-being. Co-chairs, on behalf of CANES and our collaborators, PHILAC and UNOSA, will a brand new global research and knowledge repository initiative called Indigenous Knowledge Research Infrastructure, IKRI, a novel for Sendai Framework implementation. The IKRI expects to stimulate collaboration between disaster management authorities, emergent-based solution developers and providers, and the indigenous communities for promoting nature-based solutions. Co-chairs and distinguished delegates, the emerging IKRI concept offers a unique opportunity that forwards the imperative to realize regenerative sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Pimpikrar for the intervention. Now I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Alexander Lucas Alves, National Secretary of Protection and Civil Defense of Brazil. We have the floor, sir.
Boa tarde a todos. Em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de cumprimentar o governo da Indonésia pela excelência da organização e elegância com que temos sido recebidos nesse país. O Brasil entende ser importante, no âmbito da UNDRR, desenvolver maior amplitude e integração no tratamento das ações nacionais de redução de riscos e desastres, nos níveis internacional, regional, subregional e transfronteiriço. Nas Américas, por exemplo, esse tema é tratado na Organização dos Estados Americanos e no Mercosul. Nesse mesmo sentido, o Brasil recomenda ao UNDRR considerar o fortalecimento de parcerias entre agências, fundos e programas das Nações Unidas, com vistas à maior integração de seus recursos para apoiar as ações de cooperação internacional em bases multissetoriais e multidisciplinares, respeitando prioridades nacionais tanto para a redução dos riscos e desastres e a criação de resiliência, como nas indispensáveis ações de resposta emergencial e de recuperação e reconstrução pós-desastres. Seriam exemplos o Escritório de Coordenação de Assuntos Humanitários das Nações Unidas, entre outros. O Brasil também tem destacado a importância de ampliar os recursos dedicados ao UNDRR para a cooperação técnica aos Estados, integrando ações de prevenção, planejamento e redução do risco de desastres, a resposta emergencial e a recuperação e a reconstrução pós-desastres, com especial atenção à situação de pequenos estados insulares em desenvolvimento, de países menos desenvolvidos, de países em desenvolvimento sem litoral e de países africanos em geral. O Brasil está disponível para atuar com Estados-membros e demais stakeholders no âmbito do NDRR e demais instâncias multilaterais supracitadas. Muito obrigado.
I thank Mr. Alves for the statement. Now I would like to invite Mr. Hedi Shili, Assistant Director, Ministry of Environment and Quality of Life from India. You have the floor, sir.
شكرا سيد الرئيس، شكرا لإعطائنا الكلمة. أود أن أتوجه في البداية بجزيل الشكر إلى حكومة أندونيسيا وشعبها كرم الضيافة الذي لاحظناه خلال الأيام هذه، وكذلك على كل المنظمين وخاصة مكتب الأمم المتحدة للحد من مخاطر الكوارث. أيها السيدات والسادة، إن المدة منذ 2015 تاريخ المصادقة على إطار سنداي ليست بطويلة، ولكن التغيرات في الوضعية مقارنة بالوضعية سنة 2015 كبيرة جدا، مما يجعل هذا التقييم النصف المرحلي ضرورة للاستفادة من الخبرات المكتسبة خلال هذه السنوات الماضية. سيدة الرئيسة، خلال السنوات الأخيرة أصبحت تأثيرات التغيرات المناخية في تواتر كبير، وكما أصبحت ذات واقع ملموس وزادت حدتها بتونس، حيث تم تسجيل العديد من موجات الحر والفيضانات، مما جعل من ظاهرة التغيرات المناخية موضوع حديث كل المواطنين وحتى عامة الشعب بتونس، مما جعلنا نفكر في الموضوع بأكثر جدية، وسهل عنا كيفية اتخاذ القرارات من طرف أصحاب القرار ووضع استراتيجية وطنية للحد من مخاطر الكوارث إلى غاية 2030. وتم تقديمها إلى كافة القطاعات، وكذلك إيجاد بعض التمويلات للانطلاق في تنفيذها. كما تم وضع مشاريع نموذجية على الصعيد المحلي واستراتيجيات محلية، ونود تعميم هذه التجربة على كل المدن التونسية. كما أننا عملنا على الانطلاق في وضع منصة وطنية للتصرف في مخاطر الكوارث. أيضا جائحة كوفيد-19 بيّنت العديد من الإمكانيات، حيث تبين أنه بإمكاننا وضع منظومات في وقت قياسي والاستجابة في وقت قياسي. كما بيّنت على الصعيد العالمي أن التعاون الدولي يمكن أن يكون في وقت قياسي وبآلاف المليارات. نود أن يتم هذا بصفة دائمة وخلال الأوقات وتنفيذ المشاريع، حتى نتجنب الخسائر التي تمت من جائحة كوفيد. إننا نطلب خلال هذا التقييم المرحلي الإشارة إلى ضرورة تسهيل إجراءات الحصول على كافة التمويلات والزيادة فيها، وحتى تجنب الخسائر عند الاستجابة، وكذلك ضرورة توفير التكنولوجيات والمعرفة اللازمة لكل الدول وعلى كل المخاطر، حتى لا نضطر أن نوفرها عند الاستجابة مثل ما تم جائحة كوفيد-19. ونشكركم على حسن الإصغاء. شكرا.
Thank you, Mr. Shili, for the intervention. Now I pass the floor to my co-chair.
Thank you very much. So I would now like to give the floor to Major General Mohammed Abded Maksud, Chief of Crisis, Emergency and Disaster Risk Reduction Sector of the Egyptian Cabinet. Sir, you have the floor.
شكرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أشارك زملائي في توجيه الشكر للحكومة الإندونيسية ومكتب الأمم المتحدة للحد من مخاطر الكوارث على ما قدموه من جهد كبير لإقامة هذا المنتدى، والحقيقة بيمثل بادرة جيدة جدا لفكرة الحد من مخاطر الكوارث. سيدة الرئيسة، سيدي الرئيس، إنه من دواعي سروري المشاركة في الاجتماع الهام اللي بيعد منصة للحوار بين الدول من خلال مكتب الأمم المتحدة للحد من مخاطر الكوارث، واللي بيلعب دور رئيسي فيما يتعلق بالحد من مخاطر الكوارث ودمجها في السياسات الخاصة بالتنمية المستدامة والتكيف مع التغيرات المناخية. ويسعدني في هذا اللقاء أن نوجه الدعوة لحضراتكم للمشاركة معنا في مؤتمر الأمم المتحدة للمناخ، قمة المناخ اللي بتستضيفها إن شاء الله مدينة شرم الشيخ كوب 27 في نوفمبر القادم. والحقيقة احنا بنرى أن مؤتمر المناخ كوب 27 بيمثل فرصة جيدة لتعزيز التعاون وتكثيف العمل على دمج التكيف مع تغير المناخ في سياسات وخطط التنمية وبرامج وخطط الحد من مخاطر الكوارث، واستثمار الزخم زايد للتكيف المتكامل مع تغير المناخ والتخطيط للحد من مخاطر الكوارث على المستويات الإقليمية والدولية والوطنية، وهو ما سينعكس بالضرورة على مسيرة التقدم المحرز في مجال تنفيذ إطار سنداي للحد من مخاطر الكوارث، خاصة وأن إجراء استعراض منتصف المدة لتقييم هذا التقدم في إطار سنداي سيتم العام القادم، واللي بيركز على دمج الحد من الكوارث في السياسات، وده بيتزامن مع تقييم ومراجعة عالمية لمستوى التقدم في تنفيذ أطر عمل دولية أخرى بتشمل أهداف الأمم المتحدة للتنمية المستدامة واتفاق باريس المناخية. الحقيقة أنه رغم الظروف الصعبة اللي مر بها العالم في خلال العامين الماضيين بسبب كوفيد-19 وما ترتب عليه من تداعيات سلبية وتأثيرات متعددة، إلا أن الحكومة المصرية كانت حريصة على الاستثمار بشكل كبير فيما يتعلق بالحد من الكوارث من خلال إقامة العديد من المشروعات والقومية والتنموية للحد من مخاطر الكوارث، ولعل أهمها كان مشروع تطوير المناطق العشوائية السكن غير الآمن من خلال تنفيذ عدد 55 مشروع لتطوير العشوائيات على مستوى الدولة بنحو 250 ألف وحدة سكنية، وإعادة تأهيل وتطوير وبناء وحدات سكنية جديدة بمناطق جديدة آمنة وبديلة. تم الإعلان عن الانتهاء تماما من ظاهرة المناطق العشوائية الخطرة بكل تصنيفات الخطورة التي أقرها برنامج الأمم المتحدة للمستوطنات البشرية. أيضا لدينا المشروع القومي للطرق، والذي تم عمله خلال العامين الماضيين فيما يقرب من حوالي 40 ألف كيلومتر من الطرق تم إما بنائهم طرق جديدة أو بناء وإصلاح ورفع كفاءة طرق كانت موجودة بالفعل، والهدف منها أشكرك شكرا. أيضا مشروعات الحماية من أخطار السيول ومشروعات المبادرة الحماية حياة كريمة اللي بتمثل حوالي 4500 قرية وفيما يقرب من حوالي 500 مليار.
I thank Major General Mohammed Abdel Maksud for his intervention. Before giving the floor to the next speaker, I would like to mention that the Slido is being used for collecting answers to the plenary questions during their session. Those who are in this room can connect on Slido, slido.com using your mobile phones. Insert the code that is shown on the room screen. And for those who are following this plenary online in Hopin, you can access the tabs. You can accept the tab poll, or you can accept the tab polls and Q&A, which is on the right-hand side of the menu. If we have more time, we can show the results at the end of this plenary. So please do participate. Now, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Ramona Miranda, who is a member of the Women's Major Group. Ms. Miranda, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity for the Women and Gender constituency to make our intervention. Multiple and intersecting impacts of pandemics, the climate crisis, including intensifying disasters, have and will continue to increase the challenges to live in a world free from fear and want, as we have seen in the past few years. Women and other marginalized groups who have faced restrictions all their lives because of who they are, their ability, where they live, and the limitations placed on their rights and freedoms, and this despite commitments and treaty obligations to human rights, gender equality, and social inclusion, were impacted even more, as the evidence shows. The commitments coming out of the current global platform and the second half of the implementation of the Sendai Framework must be in line thus with our aspirations for resilience and safety and protection. The midterm review of the Sendai Framework enables us an opportunity to accelerate inclusion and accountability of outcomes on gender equality, women's empowerment, and leadership. Let me outline some key aspects we believe are key. We must be able to measure progress of gender mainstreaming at national level against explicit indicators so that all stakeholders are accountable to the outcomes and framework on gender equality, women's empowerment, and leadership, as well as commitments to other international human rights treaties. We need the leadership roles of women, especially young women, to be given space so that they are equally represented in political and decision-making processes. Localization of action and aid must be led by women, especially young women. We need to adopt and increase feminist financing for DRR. We need to dedicate resources to sustain and enhance women's resilience to disasters in the form of capacity building, equal access to information and infrastructure, livelihood support, finance and logistics, etc. Prevention of gender-based violence and promotion of sexual and reproductive health and rights needs to be integrated into efforts at every stage of disaster and crisis management. We need to acknowledge that gender equality and social inclusion in DRM is an opportunity to ensure all DR actions are accessible to all communities. For all of this to happen, we also need to have strong coherence between different UN agencies and more so greater clarity and functional coordination on all DRM institutions and national provincial planning institution and women's ministries and missionaries for the effective realization of the Sendai Framework outcomes. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Miranda for her intervention, and now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Nadia Haddad, Executive Member of the European Disability Forum. Ms. Haddad, you have the floor.
Much. I would like to thank the government of Indonesia for organizing this. And so we have realized review on disability inclusive risk reduction policies and across Europe and Central Asia. And following the 5 priority gaps resulting from a lack of awareness and prioritization of the disability inclusion in disaster preparedness, responses and recovery. So the first point is lack of disability disaggregated data by age, sex, and type of disability. A second point is lack of representation, coordination, and partnership with representative organizations of persons with disabilities. The third point is lack of accessibility of crisis communication, risk information, critical infrastructure, and services. The fourth point is lack of expertise on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, and also lack of investment in disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. So we see that the need for participation of persons with disability through their representative organization is something crucial, and we call all governments to ensure implementation of the Sendai Framework and to fulfill also their legal obligation under the Convention on Those with Disabilities. So we ask to achieve this by prioritizing the development and implementation of the fully inclusive disaster risk reduction strategy like the Target E mentioning in the Sendai Framework, and promoting effective cross-sectoral partnership through meaningful engagement with organizations of persons with disabilities in all aspects of climate actions and disaster risk reduction, including preparedness, responses, and recovery by recapitalizing, really understanding risk disaster, and also ensure that the representation of meaningful participation in disaster and climate risk governance and related coordination mechanism, including national platforms of DRR and humanitarian cluster system. Designate focal points for disability within the government units responsible for DIR and climate action. Ensure also that everything related to DRR and climate change actions, strategic frameworks and plans of action are including covering the diversity of disability and informed by disability, gender, age analysis and prevent the expansions of inequality exacerbated by climate change. So I will end up by saying that ensuring that risk information, including early warning, alert system, and crisis communication is fully including covering the diversity of disability and is available in local languages and in sign languages. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that we can go for including all persons with disabilities and other groups in inclusive disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Haddad, for your intervention. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Muhammad Habib, researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Habib, you have the floor.
I would like to thank the government of Indonesia and the UNDRR for organizing this event, and thank your excellencies for the opportunities. CSIS Indonesia believes in the need of innovative disaster risk financing strategy. National budget should not and must not be the only source of DRR funding. However, we acknowledge several problems to attract participation from other sectors. Among others are the lack of incentives for partaking in DRR activities. At the current situation, the national tax regime often gives tax exemption and/or tax deduction only for disaster victims or those who help disaster response. This is a very old-fashioned thinking, generating more participation only after a calamity occurs in lieu of minimizing disaster risk. We need to adapt active policies to stimulate disaster preparedness activities, like the way Indonesia waives the odd-even traffic policy, as well as the luxury goods sales for electric vehicle owners. In addition to that, we may want to lower insurance premiums, tax for vulnerable groups in disaster-prone region, so we can expand disaster protection for this group. We also need to align disaster risk reduction program with the environmental, social, and governance, or as ESG, initiatives that are currently mainstreamed among private sectors. With that being said, I return the floor back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Habib. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Gamil Said, Sendai Focal Point and Director General of Environmental Emergencies, Ministry of Water and Environment of Yemen. Mr. Said, you have the floor.
شكرا جزيلا، ونجدد الشكر لحكومة إندونيسيا ولبرنامج الأمم المتحدة للحد من مخاطر الكوارث على على تنظيم هذه الفعالية الدولية التي نجتمع من خلالها لنتشارك المعلومات، نشارك الخبرات، تكون لدينا أيضا بمعرفة متبادلة ما بين الخبرات بقية الدول. حقيقة ارتفاع معدلات الكوارث هو ما يلمس في خلال الفترة الأخيرة، ويلاحقه بشكل مباشر مزيد من الفقر للمجتمعات الخاصة التي هي أصلا أو هي بالأصل فقيرة، وتزيد معدلات الكوارث من ما هي. ارتفاع معدلات الفقر هذا الذي سببته الكوارث وكان بشكل رئيسي ناتج عن تغيرات المناخ العالمية، والتي أسهمت فيه الدول الفقيرة بأقل مستويات من الانبعاثات، ولكنها تأخذ النصيب الأكبر من حصة الخسائر التي تلاحقها. هذا الأمر يتطلب من الكثير الوقوف بجدية مثل هذه مع هذه الدول، وتعزيز من أجل تعزيز قدراتها وبناء قدرات الصمود من أجل التسوية. تخصيص الموارد أمر مطلوب أيضا لهذه من أجل رفع بناء استراتيجيتها الوطنية. نحن الآن في الجزء الثاني من سنداي، ونتحدث عن بعض الدول التي لم تتمكن حتى من إنجاز استراتيجيتها الوطنية بسبب الظروف المالية. لا شك بأن الجميع يدرك أيضا أن اليمن يعيش حالة حرب على مدى 8 سنوات منذ إطلاق إعلان سنداي، والحرب دائرة في اليمن، وهذا أيضا قد ضاعف من المشكلات العالية التي تعيق اتخاذ إجراءات سليمة للحد من مخاطر الكوارث. نعيد التكون بحاجتنا لتبني منتديات وطنية خلال حتى هذه الأوضاع، وتعزيز نظام إنذار مبكر ورفع مستويات الوعي لدى أفراد المجتمع إلى جانب بناء الاستراتيجيات الوطنية. شكرا جزيلا لكم.
I thank Mr. Said for his intervention. Now I will pass the floor to the last speaker of this plenary, Senogo Martin, Program Manager of the National Union of Disabled Persons of Uganda. You have the floor. Do we have the program manager? Yes. Maybe is the microphone not working?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank UNDR and the government of Indonesia for having us all here. I also would like, in addition to what Elham Yufisan from the Interdisability Alliance said, as the National Union of Disabled Persons of Uganda, as part of the midterm review, we strongly believe that in order for us to be inclusive of disability in whatever we are doing, it's important, just like the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction commits, we need to work closely and in collaboration and consultation with persons with disabilities and their organizations. This is because we may not be able to have separate resources for disability. But if we work closely with organizations of persons with disabilities and their organizations, we'll be able to know how to include them in the different activities around the disaster management cycle. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin, for your intervention. Now, this has been a really fascinating exchange of views, sharing of information, putting forward requests, putting forward concerns, challenges, and looking into opportunities. And it has been indeed a very thought-provoking discussion. Before concluding, I would now like to give the floor to my co-chair, His Excellency Ambassador Rudyard, for his concluding remarks, reflecting on the deliberations of today.
Thank you, Ms. Misutori, for giving me the floor. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I believe that we having just heard the last speaker for this plenary, and I think we can all agree that we have a very rich and stimulating exchange on this meeting, as has also been reflected by the co-chair. We have heard the views from member states and stakeholders on the topic of today's discussion, namely global financing framework and macroeconomic governance, specifically in relation to address risk and building resilience. We have also noted that much of the progress has been made in the implementation of the Sendai Framework, but I believe we share the same feeling that much more remains to be done towards 2030. These progress are being carried out by countries and stakeholders all across the world. Some of the main points that I have heard across the room and as well online, it includes to mitigate disaster risk, countries should be more innovative in its approach toward solution, particularly on financing disaster. Government budget should not be the only source. Financing for disaster risk reduction, more and more are being prioritized by government as well as the private sector. We also see countries shifting disaster risk financing from a reactive approach into a more proactive one. The narrative on risk and the global financial architecture is shifting across sectors. Additionally, there is a growing recognition of local and traditional knowledge in addressing risk and building resilience. There is also a need to ensure access to funding to gain access to technology to address current and emerging risks, and empowerment of women and other vulnerable groups to take a leadership role in disaster risk reduction. And last but not least, there is also a need to further strengthen governance at the national as well as global level to address systemic risk. This is the reflection that I can get from the session, and I would like to pass the floor again to my co-chair. You have the floor, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you very much for this very comprehensive reflection. If I may add just a few points, I also heard the call for ensuring synergies between the many different global agenda, namely the agenda for least developed countries, the Commission for the Status of Women, and of course climate change, to give a few. In this vein, there was also requests, calls for more coherence, coordination among other organizations within the UN system. And also, I felt that there was a lot of, and echoing what Ambassador Rudy had mentioned, a lot of reference to community and persons of disability, but again, expressing concern that financing for disaster risk reduction really is not yet reaching these people, so we need to find this kind of mechanism. And I do believe that this was truly also rich in the sense of the diversity of the speakers. As you know, the midterm review process will culminate in an intergovernmental process in May 2023 at a General Assembly high-level meeting. But in terms of a conference or session where not only governments but non-governmental stakeholders can voice their opinions directly, this will be the occasion. Of course, we will be reaching out continuously to non-governmental stakeholders, and we have asked governments to, when they conduct their national reviews, voluntary national reviews of the implementation of the Sendai Framework, to include as many non-governmental stock takers as possible. Please, use this opportunity of the global platform. And I would like to mention that after I conclude this session now, from 4:45, the next midterm review plenary will commence. This one will be deliberating about beyond natural hazards, operationalizing the expanded scope of the Sendai Framework, which is a very relevant theme in light of what we also discussed as the changing environment since 2015. And we will have two very important keynote speakers. One speaker of the Indonesian Parliament, and the other is the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations. So I hope that we will see many of you again in this room. Thank you very much, and this session is concluded.